During the company gala dinner, the boss handed my wife a ring and announced her as his new wife. And there, in front of everyone, I felt the ground disappear. I got up and left without looking back. The embarrassment was hers, the decision mine. She thought she was starting a new chapter, but she soon discovered she was just a trophy for his ego. When the contempt and loneliness set in, only regret remained. After a while, I found a new love, someone simple, loyal, and present, who taught me that love isn't asked for, it's built. When she tried to get closer, I was honest, I forgave her, but there was no longer room for us as a couple, only as friends. And that's when the penny dropped. You don't expect betrayal to come from the person who shared your toothbrush, your future plans, and the silences of the wee hours. You don't imagine that the person who looked you in the eye and said, "Forever," would trade your name for a practiced smile, and the home you built together for a status symbol. I didn't imagine it either. I thought we were strong enough, that being by each other's side was all that was needed. I was never perfect, but I was whole. I gave everything. I was there on the good days, the bad days, and the days when only a hug held the world together. She, little by little, started not coming back on time anymore, started laughing less at my jokes, started caring less about the little things that used to make her smile. I didn't realize I was already losing even before the betrayal happened. What destroyed me most wasn't the choice she made that night, it was everything she had already failed to choose for days, months, maybe years. She stopped choosing me, and I only realized it when the last door was closed with the palm of another hand. The room was full, the lights overhead shone as if everything were perfect, and the sound of silverware clinking against glasses was almost poetic, almost. He called her to the stage with that irritating confidence of someone who thinks they can do anything. When he took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger, I felt my stomach churn. Her eyes filled with tears, but they weren't of guilt, they were of pride. She knew I was there. She looked, for a brief second, and hesitated. But she didn't back down. She chose to continue. She chose the shine, the pose, the position. She didn't look at me anymore. And neither did I. I just got up, straightened my jacket, and left. There was nothing left there. Not us. Not her. Not love. That night, the walk home seemed endless. The whole city seemed silent, as if it, too, had lost faith in something. I opened the door and stared into the emptiness of the living room as if it were the first time I'd seen my own solitude. And in that silence, I sat on the sofa, took off my ring, and placed it on the table. No tears. No outbursts. Just an absurd weariness, as if I'd been carrying alone the weight of a marriage that was long dead. And maybe it was. I was the only one who didn't want to see it. She didn't contact me in the following days. The whole company found out, of course. Gossip was rife in the hallways. Someone commented that she looked different, more vain, more elegant. I just smiled with one corner of my mouth. It wasn't vanity, it was the disguise of guilt. The pose of regret not yet assumed. While she basked in the spotlight of her new role as the boss's wife, I sank deeper and deeper into myself, trying to understand what had happened. I sifted through photos, old notes, promises made in the dim light. I tore myself apart, searching for places I could have been less, failed to listen. But I didn't find enough flaws to justify betrayal. What I found was surrender. And surrender, when scorned, doesn't need explanation, it needs mourning. It took months for me to breathe easily again. Months until the image of her smiling beside him stopped tormenting me on nights when the pillow still smelled of her. And it was only after much pain, much therapy, and much silence that life surprised me. Not with another perfect woman, nor with some incredible story of overcoming. But with someone simple. Someone who listened to me. Who looked me in the eyes calmly, in no rush to heal. Who didn't want to change, or prove anything to me. I just wanted to be there. Present. Truly. At first, I resisted. I was still wounded, wary of anything that felt like love. But she didn't force it, didn't pressure me. She waited. And one ordinary Sunday, as we laughed over spilled coffee in the kitchen, I realized I was in love. Not because of what she did for me, but because of how I felt being myself with her. It was love without effort, without competition, without an audience. It was true love. And it was in this new love that I found peace again. I came to understand that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, and that forgiving someone isn't a gift to the other, it's a gift to yourself. When she finally reached out to me, I wasn't surprised. It was written. She'd been wavering in her choices, and life takes a heavy toll on those who bet on the glitter and despise the warmth. When she sat across from me and said, "I was wrong," I just took a deep breath. Her eyes were heavy, her voice trembled. And I didn't feel anger. Just a deep regret for everything we could have been. She said she still loved me. That she even missed our silences. That nothing was the same, and that only now did she understand the value of what she had lost. I listened to her. Really. Not to retort, not to accuse, but to bring closure. I said that forgiveness was real, but that love no longer lived within me in the same way. That she was part of my history, but no longer part of my present. That I wanted her to be happy, but far from me. Her eyes filled with tears. She tried to touch my hand, but I gently pulled away. And for the first time, I saw in her the pain that had previously only existed within me. The pain of losing something that would never be the same again. She still tried to get closer to me other times. Always with affection, always with a glimmer of hope. But time is unforgiving. And love, when deeply hurt, learns to protect itself. It hit her when, one of the last times, I calmly asked, "If I still loved you, maybe I would believe in us. But today, I just wish you peace." She didn't answer. She just nodded and walked away. And I stayed. Not with longing, but with serenity. Because, in the end, what she destroyed made me build something much greater, self-love. What remained of her was the emptiness of what could have been. And from me, the learning that true love doesn't scream, doesn't beg, doesn't argue, it offers itself. And if it isn't accepted, it leaves. But her story was far from over. And when life decided to return precisely everything she had given to the world, the pain came without an audience, without glamour, and without anyone to share it with. She thought she had lost a husband. But only then did she understand she had lost a love that would never return. And cruelest of all, she would lose again. And this time, he would miss seeing me smile for another reason. Welcome to the channel. Here, we don't romanticize betrayal, we openly expose its consequences. All the stories are fictional, but inspired by the realities of those who have suffered, regretted, or lost everything due to a bad choice. The goal is clear, to show that betrayal doesn't elevate anyone, it destroys. Get ready, because what you're about to hear is a story shocking, emotionally intense, and that may change the way you see love. Good story. They met on an ordinary afternoon, one of those when the world seems to slow down for a few moments, just to allow two destinies to cross. Lucas had gone to a small bookstore downtown to look for a gift for his mother when he bumped into Anna. She was sitting on the floor, leafing through an old novel with eyes that seemed to traverse time. It was an unpretentious, almost banal encounter, but with the power of something born silently yet already carrying the weight of eternity. He apologized, she smiled, and in that smile there was something of home. The conversation began there, next to the bookshelf of literary classics, and continued for a 2-hour walk until late afternoon. Both were amazed at how much they had in common, a love of details, a taste for quiet cafes, and an irrepressible desire to find peace in such a noisy world. Lucas, a civil engineer, was practical, observant, and sensitive in a discreet way. Anna was an administrative analyst, passionate about routine and stability, but with a strong emotional side that she hid well behind her determined demeanor. The first few months were a light, balanced dance full of discovery. Simple outings, home-cooked dinners, texts exchanged at random times just to remind each other they were there. Lucas was captivated by the way Anna set the cutlery on the table as if it were a sacred ritual, by the care she took with every little detail of the house. Anna, on the other hand, felt safe with him, as if she had finally found a place where she could take off her armor without fear. He was presence. He was constancy. The kind of man you chose to be with, every day, even when the routine weighed on you, even when you weren't sure what you were doing with your life. There were no exaggerated promises. There was shared silence, laughter on Sunday mornings, and a kind of affection that didn't need to be proven. Their relationship grew with the solidity of well-cared-for things. Soon, they were living together. A modest apartment, but one they transformed with their own hands. Every corner of the living room told a story, every wall painted together held a memory. He tended the plants, she organized the bookshelf. They argued over which painting to put on the living room wall and laughed when they ended up choosing neither. It was the kind of partnership that seemed unshakable, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. There were fights, of course. As in every relationship. But no pain went unspoken, no hurt unexplained. They learned together. About themselves. About how to love each other without erasing themselves. And about how balancing everything isn't always easy. Lucas was methodical. He liked to know where his tools were, to arrive at work at the same time every day, to maintain an organized routine. Anna, on the other hand, was more impulsive. Sometimes he forgot dates, other times he surprised her with a special dinner on a random Tuesday. This difference was never a problem, it was, in fact, what made everything richer. Lucas admired her spontaneity, and Anna felt protected by the structure he brought. Over time, they began building not just a house, but larger plans. They talked about children in soft conversations, always with a smile on their faces and eyes full of hope. Neither seemed in a hurry, but both knew, this was the path. Work also brought them together. Lucas was discreet, but respected for what he did. He rose gradually, competently, and without stepping on anyone's toes. Anna was admired for her dedication. She was the kind of employee who earned the trust of her bosses for her efficiency and for remaining steadfast even under pressure. They were both proud of each other. Lucas made a point of telling his friends that Anna was the most intelligent woman he'd ever met, and Anna spoke of Lucas with the sparkle in her eyes of someone who knows she's found someone rare. They also shared a sense of justice, a work ethic, and an aversion to the dirty play that sometimes permeated the corporate environment. They didn't engage in gossip, didn't seek shortcuts, and preferred the more difficult but cleaner path. This led them to support each other, especially in times of frustration or professional exhaustion. Their social circle was small but valuable. They had few close friends, but all were genuinely close. Lucas's family was always welcoming to Anna, and she, despite being more reserved, allowed herself to bond there. Her parents lived in another city, and Lucas made a point of accompanying her on every visit. He understood that, for Anna, presence was a form of affection more powerful than words, and this made her increasingly surrender to the relationship. They created rituals of their own, pizza on Saturdays, bad movies with funny commentary, spontaneous trips on holidays. Everything was simple, but full of meaning. There was no luxury, no exaggeration. There was truth. But as in almost every true story, difficult times arrived. They began to see each other less. Work began to take up more of their time, and fatigue seemed to take up more and more space between them. Lucas started leaving earlier and returning later. Anna began working on more demanding projects, with deliverables that consumed her weekends. Quality time became an exception, and silence began to become more prevalent. It wasn't a silence of anger, it was the silence of exhaustion. Of fear of broaching topics that could generate conflict. They began to grow accustomed to the distance. But there was still affection. There was still care. Even if in small gestures, in quick glances. It was as if the love was still there, but weakened by routine, by demands, by the lack of breaks. Despite this, they weren't a couple in crisis. They still made plans. They talked about moving apartments, maybe buying a house. They still dreamed, albeit in lower voices. He still made her coffee in the morning. She still left notes on the fridge with simple phrases like, "I love you, silly." But there was something different. An invisible tension that hung in the air. The kind of thing no one can name, but feels. And, even without realizing it, this tension began to shape small changes. A longer absence here, a colder response there. Intimacy began to give way to formalities. Spontaneity became effort. And, little by little, the two began to live more side by side than together. Lucas continued to believe it was just a phase. He was willing to wait, to persist, to fight. He was never one to give up easily, especially what he had built with such care. Anna, for her part, seemed more distracted. She began looking at herself in the mirror more often, leaving the house smelling different, returning home with a distant look in her eyes. Lucas noticed, but preferred not to ask. He thought it was stress. That it would soon pass. That a weekend just for them would be enough to bring everything back. But weekends were increasingly taken up by commitments, social gatherings, or, "I need to rest." The bed that had once been a shelter became a partition. Hugs became rarer. Kisses, shorter. And conversation, increasingly superficial. Still, Lucas persisted. He organized a special dinner at home on a Friday night. He prepared her favorite dish, put on their favorite playlist, lit candles, and set the table. She arrived tired, surprised, but not excited. She sat down, smiled kindly, and thanked him. During the meal, he tried to bring up light topics, talking about travels, plans, and how much he missed having her around more. She just nodded, responding with short sentences. She said everything was fine, just tired. She promised that things would get better the following month, that she just needed to finish a few projects. Lucas believed her. Because he wanted to believe. And because he still loved her as much as the first day. That night, when they went to sleep, he hugged her from behind, as he always did. She took a while to respond. But finally, she held his hand. And it was enough to fill him with hope again. The problem is, too much hope can blind. And Lucas, at that moment, didn't see that something inside her had already changed. That doors were opening elsewhere. And that the home they'd built together was beginning to crumble silently, piece by piece, right beneath his feet. He didn't know it yet, but the love he'd nurtured so deeply was about to be put to the test in a cruel and irreversible way. And a moment's decision, a choice made with his eyes closed to his heart, would change everything. Forever. The weeks following the dinner Lucas prepared were marked by a strange, almost deafening silence, as if something nameless but powerfully present hovered in the air. Anna immersed herself in work again, justifying each absence with urgent meetings, tight deadlines, and overwhelming goals. Lucas, as much as he tried not to suspect, felt the weight of an increasingly evident emotional absence. She was there, but distant. Her body shared the same space, but her soul seemed to be elsewhere. It was like looking at someone you love deeply and realizing that, although physically present, that person no longer sees you as they once did. Small things began to catch his attention. The cell phone that had previously been left lying on the table was now carefully stored, face down, with notifications disabled. Messages became discreet, smiles on the phone more restrained, and hours began to stretch beyond normal. At first, he wanted to believe it was just the weight of routine, that it would soon pass, that perhaps she was simply going through a difficult time. But intuition whispered in the back of his mind, insistent, like a warning that refused to be ignored. Lucas began to observe more. He tried not to intrude, not to be invasive, but something inside him was no longer content with vague explanations. He had always been a trustworthy man, but trust, when wounded, turns to caution. And caution turns to vigilance. Anna, on the other hand, seemed oblivious to this change. She maintained a cool gentleness, as if fulfilling a role without involvement. Her words were measured, her gestures programmed. Her spontaneity had died, but she pretended it still existed. When Lucas asked how her day was, she would reply with, "It was busy, but everything was fine," and change the subject. When he suggested a trip for two to reconnect, she said she couldn't take time off, that things were too complicated at work. He believed her, or at least tried to. Because believing hurt less than facing the harsh reality slowly unfolding before him. The household routine changed subtly. Schedules no longer meshed as they once did. Dinner, once a time for the two of them, became a solitary meal. The series they watched together now accumulated episodes he hadn't seen. Weekends, once sacred for being together, became filled with company events, meetings with the office staff, or simply, "I need to rest alone." Lucas still made her coffee every day, but he began to leave it on the table in silence, no longer hoping for a kiss of gratitude or a look that said, "We're okay." And Anna, day after day, grew more distant. There was a different sparkle in her eyes, a restlessness that didn't match the woman he'd known. It was as if she were always thinking about another place, another person, another life. There was one day in particular when everything seemed to fall apart inside. She had dressed up more than usual for an off-site meeting, something rare for her position. She wore a new dress, a more striking perfume, and makeup that wasn't common on weekdays. Lucas watched her from the doorway, leaning against the frame, saying nothing. He simply watched the scene as if witnessing a veiled goodbye. She caught his eye, smiled rehearsedly, and said she needed to impress a new business partner. He nodded, wished her luck, and watched her leave. That night, she arrived late, and for the first time, she didn't apologize. She walked in, took off her shoes, went straight to the bathroom, and then to bed, without meeting his eyes. Lucas spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling that something had, indeed, changed forever. Despite the growing pain, he tried to maintain his dignity. He didn't question, didn't probe, didn't accuse. He waited, perhaps deep down still wishing she would return on her own. But the silence between them became unbearable. Certain unspoken words carry the weight of 1,000 truths. Certain averted glances are more painful than screams. The relationship was no longer an exchange, it was a monologue, where only he insisted on keeping alive something she had clearly already let die. Her absence began to hurt in places he hadn't even known existed. It wasn't just love being lost, it was his very identity, his very sense of worth being eroded by doubt and emotional abandonment. The environment around him also began to show signs. Co-workers asked subtle questions, some of her friends seemed uncomfortable seeing him, as if they knew something he didn't. Until one day, an invitation arrived in his personal email. It was for the company's annual dinner, a formal but celebrated event where employees brought their dates and high-ranking officials were honored. Anna mentioned the event briefly, saying it would be nice if he went. The phrase sounded strange, almost formal. He hesitated, but decided he would go. Not for her, but for himself. He needed to see for himself what his instinct had been screaming for a long time. On the night of the event, he dressed in his best suit, carefully styled his hair, and arrived punctually. The room was lit with golden hues and elegantly decorated. Soft music played in the background, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed in the corners. As he entered, he spotted Anna from afar. She was stunning, surrounded by some important people from the company, laughing at something someone was saying. When she saw him, she smiled formally and walked over to him. She said she was glad he'd come, adjusted the necklace around her neck, and led him to a table. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal, or at least disguised. But Lucas noticed too many details, the way she avoided prolonged eye contact, her fidgeting, her constant glancing at the front door. Time passed, and the honors ceremony began. The company director took the stage, joked about the difficult year, thanked the team, and talked about achievements. Until, at one point, he paused and looked at the audience with a wide smile. He said that, besides celebrating their work, he also wanted to share some personal news that made him very happy. Everyone fell silent. Lucas felt a chill in his stomach, as if something was warning him of an imminent impact. The director then called Anna by name, extended his hand, and invited her to the stage. She hesitated for a second, looked around, and then came up. The entire room watched them. The director held her hand firmly and, with a proud look, announced before everyone, "It is with great joy that I share with you that we are engaged." The audience applauded. Anna tried to smile, but the gesture didn't reach her eyes. Lucas, seated, remained motionless. The blood drained from his face, sounds became muffled, as if he were underwater. The image of her on stage, with a ring he'd never seen, next to another man, before dozens of witnesses, was the cruelest photograph of an end he hadn't authorized. She knew he was there. She knew. And yet she chose to make that moment a public confirmation of the betrayal. It was the final blow. The definitive rupture between what they had been and what they would never be again. He stood up, unhurriedly, without fanfare, straightened his jacket, and left. He didn't look back. The embarrassment was hers. The decision was his. On the cold sidewalk, with the muffled noise of the party in the background, he took a deep breath and walked toward nothingness. He didn't cry. He didn't explode. He just walked. Like someone carrying the pain of a love scorned until nothing remained. Inside him, something was closing forever. But what Anna didn't know was that this would be just the first step on a path from which she would never return. And what she also didn't know, was what was to come. The apartment was silent, the same silence that had preceded the end for months, but which no longer hurt. Lucas sat at the table with a half-empty cup of coffee, his eyes fixed on his phone screen, slowly scrolling through old messages he hadn't yet had the courage to delete. It wasn't longing anymore, it was a melancholic curiosity about what had caused everything to fall apart like this. Since the company dinner, he hadn't reached out to Anna, and she hadn't made any effort to contact him either. There was a distance now cemented by a public and cruel betrayal, and by a dignity that he, even in pieces, refused to lose. But then, one morning without warning, the doorbell rang. When he opened the door, it was her. Alone, without a ring, without makeup, with sunken eyes and an expression that mixed regret with something even deeper, an emptiness she no longer knew how to hide. He said nothing, just stepped aside to let her in. Anna walked into the living room as if carrying her own weight with difficulty, looking around as if expecting to find traces of herself there, but everything had changed. The bookshelf was rearranged, the paintings moved, and on the table were flowers she would never buy. She sat down slowly, and after a few seconds of silence that felt like prolonged mourning, she finally spoke. She said she wasn't there to apologize, or just apologize, but to tell the truth. The truth she herself had been slow to face. Lucas crossed his arms, leaned back in his chair, and waited. There was no anger in his eyes, but a quiet weariness, like someone who has overcome pain but still deserves to hear why it existed. Anna said that, in the first few months after beginning her relationship with the company director, she believed she was entering a new phase, more mature, freer. She felt validated, praised, promoted, and for a time mistook all of that for love. But she soon realized she had ceased to be a partner and become a decoration. A decorative piece alongside a man who needed to exert power in every sphere, including his personal life. Their conversations were nothing more than agreements, dinners became meetings, and affection became mere gestures planned to keep up appearances. It was then that Anna began to see herself from the outside, as if observing a version of herself she didn't recognize. She no longer made her own choices, could no longer leave without warning, was no longer heard, nor truly desired. She was, as she quietly said, a trophy. Lucas listened without interrupting, but his expression slowly began to change. His gaze narrowed, his jaw tightened, and his breathing became heavier. There was something in her words that sounded more than just regret. There was an uneasiness that betrayed that this wasn't all. And then she lowered her eyes, as if the next moment required more courage than any other. She said she needed to tell him what the director had revealed to her 2 weeks after the company dinner, the same one where she was announced as his fiancée. Lucas remained silent, but his chest tightened as if he were about to hear something that would change everything again, not in pain, but in perspective. Anna then revealed, her voice breaking, that the man for whom she had exchanged their life together had never loved her. That everything, absolutely everything, had been part of a plan hatched out of vanity, out of a sick need to assert superiority. She explained that, months before approaching her, the director discovered that Lucas had turned down a promotion to avoid becoming embroiled in dirty internal company politics. This made him admire him, but also uncomfortable with the respect Lucas received from his colleagues, even without having to assert himself. Anna, unknowingly, became a pawn in this game. The director began courting her, not just out of self-interest, but as a symbolic way of winning Lucas over something he couldn't control, love. The revelation hit Lucas like a punch. He spurted himself out of his chair and walked to the window as if he needed air, as if he needed to get away from that information so as not to explode. He returned slowly, looked Anna in the eye, and asked, "Did you know?" Tears in her eyes, she replied no. That she only found out after she was in too deep, after she had left everything behind, after she could no longer go back. She said she tried to deny it, that she thought it was just paranoia, but the director himself confirmed it, in a moment of fury when he accused her of no longer being up to the task of being his wife. He said she was just a convenient choice to get the one he could never win. Lucas was silent for long seconds. It was as if everything inside him needed to be reorganized. This wasn't just a betrayal of love. It was a betrayal of his humanity, his dignity, his worth as a man, as a professional, as a human being. The woman he loved with all his heart had become a tool in the hands of a self-centered and cruel man. And she, without even knowing it, had allowed it. Anna was crying now. Not just out of regret, but out of shame. Shame for having allowed herself to be deceived, for having hurt someone who only loved her, and for having been manipulated so coldly. Lucas sat back down, but now his gaze was different. There was no more pain, no more anger, just brutal clarity. He said he understood everything now. That he understood every look, every departure, every apology. And that, even though forgiveness had already been granted, there was no more room to rebuild anything. Because the love he felt for her died the moment he realized she'd allowed herself to be ripped from him without resistance. He said he truly forgave her, not as a pretty speech, but as someone who needed to let go of what was in the past to move forward in peace. But she would need to learn to live with the guilt. Because he was no longer hers. And he never would be again. Anna tried to explain herself, saying she didn't know how to escape that trap, that she was ashamed to even face him, but she needed to tell the truth, even if it wouldn't change anything. Lucas thanked her. He told her she had done the right thing, late, but still necessary. And then, with devastating calm, he said he was in love again. With someone simple. Someone who didn't need to prove anything to the world, who simply chose to love, every day, truthfully. And that now, when he looked at Anna, he no longer saw the woman he had loved, he saw the memory of a mistake that was not just hers, but also his, for having ignored the signs, for having persisted where there was no longer any reciprocity. She didn't know what to say. Her voice was lost in her throat, and the tears she'd previously held back became sobs. She stood, grabbed her bag, and walked to the door with shaky steps. Before leaving, she turned one last time and said she hoped he was very happy. Lucas just smiled slightly and replied, "I already am." And then the door closed, not just on the house, but on an entire cycle of pain, doubt, and broken promises. But what Lucas didn't yet know, was that fate sometimes reserves unexpected encounters with the past, not to reopen wounds, but to show how much they have healed. And that this reunion, soon, would happen in a place as unlikely as it was definitive. 2 months had passed since that last conversation in the apartment. Since the afternoon Anna left and the door closed behind her with the weight of a closed chapter. Lucas hadn't looked for her again. Not out of curiosity, nor out of longing. The wound no longer bled. What remained now was a clean scar, requiring no explanation, only respect. His heart, far from numb, beat with a different frequency. A new lightness took over his days, as if he had rediscovered the pleasure of well-accompanied silence, of simple gestures, and of true affection. And this new phase had a name, a smile, and a presence: Isabella. Isabella wasn't a woman who impressed with what she said, but with what she kept quiet. She had a calm yet firm manner, an attentive gaze, and a light energy, the kind that makes any space feel like home. They met unpretentiously, at a local fair where Lucas went to pick up a gift for his niece. She was behind the artisanal ceramic stall, selling handmade pieces, with marks of imperfection that made them unique. They spoke briefly, but long enough for him to want to return the following week. And he did. Once, twice, 3 times. Until one day, she brought him coffee and cheese bread, and they talked for hours. What blossomed wasn't an immediate romance, but a connection. Isabella didn't ask too many questions, didn't probe his pain, she simply existed by his side, offering companionship without demands and listening without judgment. And Lucas, accustomed to a love that demanded constant proof, found in her simplicity a safe place to begin anew. They began seeing each other frequently. They began cooking together, taking aimless walks at night, laughing at silly things. There was something between them that dispensed with promises, because everything was felt in practice. It was the kind of love that didn't require grand gestures, but rather asserted itself through constancy. Lucas began to smile with his eyes again, to take an interest in details, to breathe a sigh of relief. And Isabella, even without knowing his entire story, perceived in his silence something she respected, someone who had loved, been hurt, and now chose to love more truly. He, in turn, no longer felt the weight of the past, he felt only gratitude for having survived it. The apartment no longer reminded him of Anna. The objects had changed, the smells too. And on the living room table, now, there were always fresh flowers, placed by Isabella every Wednesday, as a new tradition. One day, during a walk in the park, Isabella told her mother it was her birthday and that she wanted Lucas to join her for family lunch. He accepted, calmly, without hesitation. Meeting her family seemed a natural step for someone who had already decided that love could begin again without fear. The following Sunday, he dressed carefully, chose a light-colored shirt, bought a bottle of wine, and went to meet her. The lunch took place in a simple house, with the smell of lovingly prepared food and loud laughter filling the room. Lucas was welcomed, as if he already belonged there. He chatted with his aunt and uncle, helped serve dessert, played with the children. And amidst that noisy normality, something in him healed definitively. He no longer thought of Anna. Not as pain, not as longing, not as emptiness. She was now a closed memory, and all he saw there was the present. A light, honest, and possible present. But fate, in its silent irony, still had one last meeting in store. Not to reopen wounds, but to seal once and for all what needed to be sealed. The following week, Lucas was invited to speak at a technical seminar. It was an important event in his field, and he accepted enthusiastically. Arriving at the venue, after preparing for his presentation, he was greeted by an event coordinator, who explained that he would be sharing a panel with 2 other guests. When their names were mentioned, he froze. One of them was the director of the company where he and Anna worked. The same man behind the entire manipulation scheme that destroyed his marriage. Lucas didn't know how to react, but he didn't let it affect his composure. He took the stage, spoke firmly, answered questions, and was applauded. And when the other speaker was called to the panel, their eyes met. The director, now visibly older, avoided any direct eye contact. He seemed uncomfortable, as if fully aware of what he'd done. The atmosphere grew tense, but Lucas maintained his elegance. He greeted the audience, maintained his composure, and at the end of the event, was approached by colleagues who congratulated him on his clarity and competence. As he was about to leave, he heard a familiar voice behind him. It was Anna. She had attended the event. She looked tired, too thin, and her eyes were marked by deep dark circles. She smiled hesitantly, as if unsure of her right to be there. Lucas stood there, watching her for a few seconds, until she approached and asked if they could talk. He nodded, and they walked to an outdoor area where there were fewer people. Anna took a deep breath and began by saying she knew he was okay, that she'd heard he was in another relationship, and that she sincerely hoped he was happy. Lucas just watched. She continued, saying she tried to go through with her engagement but couldn't. That her relationship with the director ended weeks after that night at the event. And then, with a choked voice, she revealed that she'd moved back in with her parents, quit her job, and was trying to rebuild her life away from all that. Lucas simply said he hoped she could make it. That she deserved peace, like any human being, but that he was no longer part of her path. Anna then said that, despite everything, she needed to be grateful. That only when she lost everything did she understand who she truly was without the looks, without the positions, without the disguises. And that, as painful as it was to admit, he was the only true love she had ever had. Lucas took a deep breath, looked at her tenderly, and replied, "I believe in you. But knowing someone truly loved me isn't reason enough for me to come back. Because love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice. And you chose another path. And I chose mine too." Anna nodded, silent tears streaming down her face. She said she understood, and now she just wanted him to know how sorry she was. Lucas, with a slight smile, said, "I'm sorry too. But today, what I feel most, is gratitude for having gone through this and survived being who I am." She held back tears and waved goodbye. Lucas watched her walk away, without pain, without anger, only with a new and rare feeling, liberation. That night, lying beside Isabella, her head on his chest and her calm breathing filling the room, he knew he had won. Not because he had found another love, not because he had stopped feeling, but because he had faced the worst that anyone can experience emotionally, and still maintained his true essence. Life had repaid him with something even greater than justice, peace. And in that serene silence, there was no more room for the past. There was only the now. And the now was all he needed. The next morning arrived silently, as if the world respected the closure that the previous night had finally sealed. Lucas woke early, not from insomnia or restlessness, but because his body was now accustomed to peace. Isabella was still asleep, curled up under the white sheet, her hair spread out on the pillow, her face serene, a look of someone who doesn't demand presence, but welcomes it. He watched her for a few minutes in silence, not with the urgency of someone fearing loss, but with the gratitude of someone recognizing a rare encounter. He got up quietly, made coffee, and opened the window, allowing the soft light to flood the room. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to revisit the past, nor to wonder what would have happened if everything had been different. A mature acceptance was taking hold of him, an awareness that certain losses are fundamental for life to reposition us, even if the path is arduous and full of painful curves. And although the reunion with Anna brought an undeniable emotional weight, what remained was the confirmation that choices made with truth and responsibility lead, sooner or later, to freedom. During that week, Lucas eased back into his routine. At work, projects flowed smoothly, and the recognition that had previously been silent now manifested itself in respectful glances, invitations to lead initiatives, and discreet praise. But it wasn't professional validation that moved him, it was knowing that, even in the face of everything he'd experienced, he'd managed to remain ethical, upright, and true to his own values. With Isabella, everything seemed to move at a different pace. There were no rehearsed promises, just consistent action. She didn't pressure him for immediate answers about the future, but built the present with such consistency that the future seemed inevitable. Small habits became part of their routine, impromptu dinners with cheap wine and old music, walks through the city at dusk, conversations that lasted all night about absolutely nothing and everything at once. And in these small repetitions, Lucas found himself reshaping his own concept of love, no longer based on absolute surrender and idealization, but on real presence, on emotional sharing that requires no effort to exist. Meanwhile, Anna was following a different path. She had left the company for good, opting for something that would take her out of the rut she'd lost. She began working as a substitute teacher at a neighborhood school, something she'd never considered before, but which somehow restored her sense of purpose. The luxury, the intense social life, the elegant invitations, all of it had vanished, and with this absence, she rediscovered silences she'd previously filled with distractions. Living with her parents again, she relearned how to ask for help, how to listen to advice, how to recognize the limits she'd ignored for years. Lucas's name surfaced frequently in her thoughts, but no longer as a possibility, but as a memory. She knew there was no going back. The reunion was definitive not because of the words spoken, but because of everything that no longer needed to be said. Still, there was a need for redemption within her that went beyond his forgiveness. It was an urgency to not become hostage to the version of herself that caused all of this. Therefore, he dedicated himself zealously to his new reality, even without glamour, even without applause, seeking to rebuild his own value. Meanwhile, Lucas received an unexpected invitation. He would be honored by a professional association for his ethical trajectory and technical contributions. The event would be formal, but far from the corporate glitz that so often represented false appearances. He hesitated for a few days, debating whether to accept or whether it would simply reopen spaces he preferred to leave closed. It was Isabella who encouraged him, without pressuring him. She simply said that he deserved to be recognized not for what he suffered, but for everything he remained, even in the face of pain. He smiled, hugged her, and confirmed his presence. The ceremony would take place in a small auditorium, surrounded by colleagues in the field, former professors, and admired professionals. It was a celebration of true merit, not status. And that night, as he took the stage to accept the honor, Lucas looked out at the audience and saw familiar faces, some from the past, some from the present, and felt complete. It wasn't pride, it was serenity. After the event, while chatting with some colleagues, he was surprised by one of the coordinators from the previous seminar, the same one who had mentioned, weeks earlier, that Anna had been present. She approached, praised his speech, and, with a cautious expression, said that Anna had left something for him. It was an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. Lucas didn't read it, just carefully tucked it into his pocket. Later, at home, with Isabella already asleep, he opened the letter. The words, written in firm handwriting, began bluntly. Anna recounted not only her regret, but the details of how she had been emotionally manipulated, the times she tried and failed to leave, and how long it took her to realize she had lost much more than a relationship, she had lost herself. But what touched him most was a passage where she said that, despite everything, she was grateful that he hadn't reciprocated her pain with destruction. That his love for her, even broken, had been the anchor that kept her from sinking completely. And that, paradoxical as it may seem, it was his absence that taught her the value of his presence. Lucas read it to the end, sealed the envelope, and put the letter away in a box, alongside other memories that no longer needed revisiting, but deserved respect. The next day, alongside Isabella, walking hand in hand through the market where it all began, he felt something different. It was no longer the relief of having overcome, but the fulfillment of having grown. As they passed the ceramic stall, she smiled and commented on a new model she intended to create. He listened attentively, made suggestions, and laughed along. And in the middle of the conversation, Isabella stopped, looked him in the eye, and said, "I don't know everything you've been through, but the man I know today, is someone who hasn't lost faith in love." Lucas smiled, not on the outside, but on the inside. That sentence was, for him, the conclusion of a cycle that for so long seemed hopeless. And in that moment, he understood that forgiving someone isn't opening the door for them to return, it's closing the door through which pain used to enter. The following days continued to fall into place like pieces of a new puzzle, with softer colors and more defined lines. Life hadn't become perfect, but it had become honest. And that was more than enough. However, even with everything resolved, there was still a subtle question lingering in the air, a question Lucas couldn't fully answer, but one that was beginning to take shape. What do we do when faced with someone who has caused us so much, but who is now just a shadow of their former self? How do we deal with the dilemma between compassion and preservation? What if one day, in an unexpected situation, Anna truly needed him, not as love, not as a husband, but as a human being? He didn't know. He only knew that the love he now lives with carries not chains, but wings. And that to move on lightly, sometimes we must let go even of what once hurt. And that's how Lucas understood that the greatest victory wasn't overcoming betrayal. It was learning to love without losing himself, to forgive without being annulled, and to start over without having to erase what happened. Because the past doesn't need to be forgotten. It just needs to stop being a prison. And on that path where everything seemed to be falling apart, he discovered that the hardest part of rebuilding wasn't rebuilding the house, nor the routine, nor the trust. It was rebuilding himself. And he succeeded. But there was still one final choice to be made, one final scene to unfold, and it wouldn't come with drama, nor with tears, but with the clarity of someone who, even wounded, has decided to be whole again. On the last Friday of the month, an unexpected invitation arrived in Lucas's mailbox. It was simple, a beige envelope with familiar handwriting, no return address, just his name carefully written. Inside, a card with light blue accents and small print read, "Opening of the new Community Center for Arts and Education, Saturday, 5 p.m. Your presence will make a difference." Below, a small, handwritten note made it clear who had sent it, Anna. She had signed it with a single word, gratitude. Lucas took a few minutes to process the content. It was as if the past was once again asking him to witness the outcome of a new path that no longer included the pain that once united them. For a few seconds, he considered ignoring it, throwing away the invitation, and moving on with his plans. But something inside him, perhaps out of maturity or simply symbolic closure, decided that going would be more than right, it would be necessary. Not for her. But for himself. Arriving at the site the next day, she felt the impact of the project's transformative simplicity. The space was spacious, painted in bright colors, with murals made by children and teenagers. Volunteers from different backgrounds mingled among books, paintbrushes, notebooks, and musical instruments. The care taken in every detail was evident. It wasn't something grand in scale, but it was immense in meaning. There, where before there had been only emotional ruin, Anna had rebuilt something collective. It was no longer about clearing her name or redeeming her image, it was about returning to the world a version of herself that had perhaps forgotten existed. When she saw him, walking calmly among the children, she didn't rush to meet him. She kept her distance, respectful, and simply waved with a restrained smile. Lucas responded with the same lightness, without tension, without the past weighing on their shoulders. It was as if they both finally understood that they no longer needed to explain anything. What had been was no longer. What mattered now was what could still be built from there, but each on their own path. After a while, she approached him. She asked if he would like to see the inner rooms. He agreed, and they walked in silence through the freshly painted corridors. Reaching a reading room, Anna stopped and looked at him with eyes calmer than the last time. She said that everything there had been the result of her choice to stop looking back. That the pain had been long, but necessary, because sometimes the only way to find yourself again is to lose yourself completely. Lucas, listening attentively, didn't interrupt. When she finished, he simply replied that he was happy to see her well and that he recognized the courage it took to transform pain into service to others. But he reinforced that their journey as a couple was indeed over, and that he was at peace with that. She nodded, took a deep breath, and said something that took him by surprise, "That woman who hurt you, died. And I had to bury every part of her inside me to get here." It was a moment of raw honesty, without romance, without appeals. Just truth. Lucas simply responded with a firm, almost paternal look that made it clear, he believed her. But that didn't mean there was still room in his life. He extended his hand, and she squeezed. And in that gesture, without a hug, without exaggerated emotion, all the loose ends were closed. Everything that could still be left open between them, in that moment, dissolved in the mutual respect of two who had once been whole together, but who now remained whole on their own. In the following days, Lucas shared with Isabella what had happened. He spoke of the visit to the center, the conversation, the feeling of definitive closure. She listened attentively, without a hint of jealousy, without insecurity. Just with the care of someone who knows their own position in the other's present. And when he finished, she simply said, "I'm glad you went. Closing a cycle with truth is rarer than it seems. And you deserve to feel light." Lucas hugged her tenderly and, once again, knew she had made the right choice. Not out of reaction to the past, but out of genuine affinity with the present. The following week, the couple was invited to a get-together among the project's volunteers. Anna didn't invite them directly, but someone they shared did, and Lucas felt there was no longer any reason to avoid the place. They were all there for a greater purpose. And in that setting, full of laughter, artistic activities, and people giving of themselves for the common good, everything that had seemed heavy began to melt away. In a more private moment, while Isabella chatted with other women in the project, Lucas and Anna stood side by side for a brief moment, watching a painting activity led by children. Without looking directly at him, Anna commented, "You seem lighter, more whole." And Lucas replied, with a slight smile on his lips, "It's just that now I don't have to prove anything to anyone. Not even to myself." The answer wasn't just about the present, but a silent reckoning with the past. Their relationship, once fraught with tension, passion, hurt, and pride, was now just a point in time, a marker of what once was and now is no more. Anna, for her part, seemed to finally understand that her reconstruction no longer depended on him. And that the woman who now guided children, taught art, and promoted education was someone born from ruin but chose to flourish. On the way home in the car, Isabella asked if he was okay. Lucas smiled, looked out the window for a few seconds, and then replied, "I've never been so." She held his hand, and the silence became comfortable. There was no longer any noise between the past and the present. There was only a continuous journey, where each choice, each pain, each lesson, served to shape what they now were together. It wasn't a love built on the absence of the old, it was a love made possible precisely because the old taught them where to tread. Late that night, as he watched Isabella brush her hair before bed, Lucas felt something he hadn't recognized in a long time: emotional stability. Not the kind of stability that comes from routine or control, but the kind that arises from the simple act of being exactly where you're supposed to be, with whom you're supposed to be, and being who you truly are. It was complete emotional freedom, the kind that allows you to truly forgive without wanting to go back, move forward without resentment, and look back with respect, not longing. And it was there, with the muffled sound of water running into the sink and the gentle scent of the cream Isabella applied to her hands, that Lucas finally understood that the greatest lesson of this whole story wasn't about betrayal, nor about pain, but about choice. Because loving is a daily choice. Forgiving is too. And staying whole, even when everything tries to tear you apart, is the kind of choice that defines who you will be when it's all over. But there was still one final gesture to be made. A small gesture, but one that carried symbolism. The next morning, Lucas returned to the place where he and Anna had bought, years before, the first painting for their old apartment. The shop looked different, but the owner still recognized him. He bought a simple, raw wood frame and took the letter Anna had written weeks earlier. Not to hang it, but to keep it with dignity. Because, even though it was the fruit of a lost love, it was also the record of a true new beginning, for both of them. And then, with that frame resting on a discreet shelf in the corner of a new home, he ended it all. And in that respectful silence, a new life was already unfolding. In early autumn, when the wind began to carry the leaves that were falling from the trees with an almost melancholic whisper, Lucas decided to do something he had been putting off for weeks. He got in the car on a Friday afternoon, without telling anyone, and drove to the small coastal town where his sister had moved. He needed a few days without routines, without obligations, without fixed memories. He just wanted to breathe in a new place, to walk streets that weren't laden with memories. He took only a backpack, a few books, and his cell phone turned off. During the 3 days he spent there, he chatted with children on the beach, drew with his nephews, and slept without a set schedule. It was there, amid the salty sea air and the smell of homemade breakfast, that he realized there was no longer any trace of pain inside him. Not even in the most hidden places. The past was at peace. And for the first time in years, he could live in the present without question. Isabella felt his absence, but understood without asking. When he returned, he found her sitting on the sofa, a blanket draped over her shoulders and a light smile, as if awaiting the return of someone who hadn't run away, but simply found herself. He approached, sat beside her, and hugged her tightly, not to quell his longing, but to thank her for existing. That night, without any planning or script, Lucas looked into her eyes and told her he wanted to share his life with her. Not in a rush, nor with formal promises, but with presence, with daily choice, with that silent constancy that only mature love understands. Isabella smiled, touched his face gently, and simply replied that they were already sharing, and that all they had to do was keep doing it every day, never forgetting why. And so it was, without a ring, without an announcement, without a party, that they began to build a definitive life together. The kind of life that doesn't need an audience, because it's sustained by respect, truth, and reciprocity. Meanwhile, Anna continued her solitary but conscious journey. The community center was gaining momentum, and her work with vulnerable youth began to be recognized by local organizations. She taught writing workshops, helped with adult literacy, and organized fundraising campaigns. Her life was no longer surrounded by lights, empty praise, or corporate goals. It was now marked by sincere looks, small advances, and stories of overcoming that she helped build without expecting anything in return. One day, as she was leaving the center, she saw a mother thanking her for a donated notebook, saying that her son had finally started writing his own name. And there, in that moment, she understood that her life had gained a new kind of value. Not the value of status, but the value of service. She still felt, on quieter nights, the absence of what had once been love. She still had confused dreams of old smiles. But she no longer harbored the desire to return. She knew she didn't deserve that return, and more than that, she knew that the forgiveness she had received was all she could hope for. One morning, sitting on her porch, she wrote a letter to herself. She said the greatest punishment wasn't losing Lucas, but taking too long to realize that love isn't built on ego. That while she sought recognition in the eyes of a man who used her as a showcase, she ignored the gaze of someone who truly saw her. And that if she could sleep peacefully today, it was because, despite everything, she chose not to remain in her error. That her fresh start didn't erase the past, but gave it a new place, that of a hard but necessary learning experience. Time passed with the discretion that only time can possess. And on a random Saturday, Lucas and Isabella received an invitation. The community center's library would be inaugurated, and there would be a small tribute to all who, directly or indirectly, had contributed to making that space a reality. Lucas's name was among those mentioned, not for donations, but for the influence his silent journey had had on Anna's transformation. He considered refusing, not out of resentment, but because he didn't want to return to something that had already been resolved. But Isabella, with her gentle wisdom, said he should go, not to show off, but to recognize that the good we sow sometimes blossoms in soil we never even knew we'd touched. At the ceremony, seated discreetly at the back of the small audience, the two watched the children's performance, heard moving testimonies, and, at the end, saw Anna take the small stage. She looked different. Thinner, shorter hair, but with a firm gaze. In her speech, she thanked everyone who believed in the project, and for a brief moment, she looked to the back of the room and said, "And to those who once taught me what it means to be truly loved, even without knowing it, thank you. Some lessons save lives, even when they lose us." It was the last time they looked at each other. There were no more letters, no more reunions. Just a silence that, for once, didn't hurt. And so, over time, the story settled into place. Lucas and Isabella moved to a simple house on the outskirts, where they created a garden that they tended together every afternoon. They took their time getting married, made no announcements, and created no external expectations. They built a routine of discreet but unshakable love. He continued working in engineering, but now also gave lectures on professional ethics and emotional balance. Isabella opened a ceramic studio, where she taught techniques to women looking to start over. Together, they created a life where there was no room for games or doubt. Only for truth. And Anna? Anna remained who she chose to be after her fall. She never got involved with anyone in the same way again. Perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of respect for what she lost. But she continued working, teaching, and writing. She became a local leader in self-esteem recovery projects for women. And one day, looking in the mirror, she realized she no longer needed to ask for forgiveness to move forward. Forgiveness was already within her, and the world, somehow, had welcomed her back. Alone, yes, but at peace. This story ends here, with the certainty that some losses are irretrievable, and that is precisely why our choices must be made consciously. Because love is not eternal by nature. It is eternal only as long as it is cared for. As long as it is chosen. And when it is exchanged, betrayed, or neglected, it dies. Not all at once, but in pieces. Until nothing remains but emptiness. Comment below with your thoughts on this story. Your opinion is very important to us. And if you were moved, engaged, or reflected on what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue bringing you real, human, painful, yet necessary stories. And remember, cheating isn't just a momentary choice. It's a decision that tears up roots, breaks bonds, and destroys everything planted with love. It corrodes not only the relationship, but the very identity of the perpetrator. And sometimes, what you lose, you never find again. This channel does not support, justify, or normalize any kind of betrayal. Here, the truth is told as it is, harsh, shocking, but always with the purpose of warning and transformation. Because true love, once lost, rarely returns to its former self. Until the next story.